Hi, my name is Adrian, and welcome back to the 7th devlog of my unnamed indie game that combines top-down movement and platforming with roguelite and bullet hell elements. And in this devlog, I'll be talking about the huge weapons update, in which I created 6 new weapon types, and along with how I created 30 brand new spells for my game. So let's get started. In my previous devlog, I got some feedback from my game, and one of those feedbacks was that combat was just not that fun. One of the reasons for that was because there was not enough weapon variety, which makes sense, because in the demo that I put out, there were only 4 weapons, with 3 of those weapons essentially being the exact same thing, with the exception of damage and swinging speeds. So at first, I tried to make these weapons more interesting by giving them a chargeable attack, but that didn't fix my issue. So instead, I decided to make a new ranged weapon, the slingshot. The slingshot is basically the same as the bow, except it goes further, but it does less damage. And it was a pretty simple feature to add, and after a few minutes this is what I got. And I think it turned out well. However, it didn't fix up the issue of most of the weapons working the exact same way. So after a brainstorming session, I came up with this shield weapon that will allow the player to dash through an enemy dealing damage. So I started to work on that. And there's always a trend where the first thing I work on will always be the easiest thing to implement, while the second thing will make me want to bash my head into a wall. And this time it was no exception. Getting the dash to work was very easy, since I saw the code from my very first devlog in which the player was able to dash on their own. But getting this to work with the enemy is what broke me, because no matter what I did, the player would always take damage when colliding with an enemy. And after a long while of typing and punching the wall, I decided that instead of the player going through the enemy, the shield will instead bounce the player backwards, sort of like a bumper car. And finally I had something working, and it was pretty fun to use. My next idea was to add this chain weapon, and the idea behind this weapon is that when used, it would pierce through enemies, and if you press the left mouse button again, it will retract the weapon back towards you. At first I thought about doing this with the sword object, but I very quickly realized that the sword will always be attached to the player, and so throwing the sword at a distance would just not be possible. So instead, I made a chain object that, when you left click, it'll spawn the object and your sword will turn invisible at the same time, so that it looks like the sword's the one being launched. And here's how that looks. And while I was testing out things with the chain object, I decided to see how it would feel if I made it retract when you hit an enemy, or after it reaches a certain distance. And I loved it. In fact, it kind of reminded me of the punching attack from Dead Estate. So I decided that I would take this code and use it as the basis for my next weapon, the punch gloves. And like I just said, it retracts when you hit an enemy or after a certain distance. And every punch would move you forward a bit, and what sets this apart from the chain is that these attacks are more rapid, and here's how it looks. And from this punching attack, I made a spear attack that had more range but did less damage. And that's why I made 3 different weapons from the same concept. And the final weapon I added to my game was the scythe, because I'm a sucker for scythe weapons. They're just so cool looking, so I had to have one in my game. And while it is a melee weapon, it does not work in the same way as the swords. You can't charge it, and instead of swinging it in front of you, it'll swing in a 360 degrees all around you, giving you an omnidirectional attack. And here's how that looks. And that's how I implemented 6 new weapons into my game so far. There might be at least 2 more weapons I want to add down the line, but I think this is unique enough. Next up are the spells that I've added to the game. As of right now, there are a total of 30 new spells in the game. And so to save up a lot of time, I'm not going to go into too much detail into all of them. And first up was a spell I wanted to make ever since I added the golem boss. This is the magic laser. And I don't need to explain how this one works. But for those who really need it, right click, destroy everything in your path. Really simple, and it was very simple to add since it uses the same code that the golem uses. After the laser, I made a saw blade attack that works just like the magic shield attack, but instead of blocking bullets, it damages enemies over and over. It's a simple spell, but it gets the job done. The next spell is teleport, and it's exactly how it sounds. You right click and you go anywhere where the mouse was. It's a perfect spell for when you're being cornered. And the last spell I did for today was something I want to add since day one as well, the homing attack. I just had no idea how to go about making it though, so I borrowed online and decided to use particles to make it look cooler. And here's how that looks like. Now you might be saying to yourself, wow, that's a lot of things done in one day. 6 new weapons and 4 new spells? And it's 1 AM. Surely it's time to call it a day, right? Unfortunately for both of us, you're wrong. Instead, what I wanted to do is work on something I call weapon elements. What that is that weapons can be made up of different things, such as wood, stone, iron, and gold. And there would be differences in these elements when it came to damage. For example, a wooden sword would do a lot less damage than a gold one. Of course, these aren't the only elements I plan to have in game. I maybe could add a fire element that allows your weapons to inflict burn on an enemy. But that's something I'll add later down the line. And since I didn't feel like punishing this broken home I call a body anymore, I went to bed. And that was the end of day 1. At the start of the next day, I started working on 3 new spells. First up is Rock Ball. What it does is in the name, you drop rocks on people. And fun little fact about me, I love cacti. So why wouldn't I add them to the game? So that's why I made a spell called Cactus Ball. It shoots a spread of cacti all over the place. But when they touch an enemy, they'll stay stuck to them and deal continuous damage. Just like the burn effect, except the cacti never go away. Stone people, we love them, they're in video games, so they're going to be in mine. Stone Skin is the next spell. You turn into stone and you can't move for a period of time, but nothing will ever hurt you again. It's like the Tanuki suit for Super Mario Bros. 3, except you don't become a furry. After this, I showed what I had so far in a call with a group of my friends, and they really liked it. But one of my friends suggested that the player should only be able to use 3 weapons per level. And if a player picked up a weapon, they'd be given the option to switch it with a weapon in their lineup, or to put it directly in their inventory. This would allow the player to strategize a bit more when starting a level. And I tried to do this, and this took me 3 hours to fail. Yep, this was a certified head-smashing moment, since I would always get so close, but then something would get messed up and put another dent in my wall. The easiest part was stopping the player from accessing their weapon inventory during a level. The hardest part came from weapon swapping when you found a weapon. So I decided to just not hurt myself any longer and made it so that if you did find a new weapon during a level, it'd go straight into your inventory. And if you wanted to swap it out with another weapon, you'd have to be back in the hub to do so. I doubt this would be a hassle for the player since 1, levels don't take that long to complete, and 2, there's already an option to go straight back to the hub if you really wanted to try out this new weapon, so I doubt this would get in the way of the player. However, if you do think that the player should have access to all their weapons, please let me know, since I already have the original code somewhere, and I can always change it back. I always found it annoying when I couldn't see what weapons I had in my lineup at all times, so I added that as well. And now I have 3 options. 1, I can redo the sprites of the weapons in the player's hand and make it look more accurate to the weapon icons that are in the inventory. 2, I can add a new elemental type which would allow for even more spell types. Or 3, I go to bed. And so of course I went with option 2, but I had trouble coming up with ideas on what elements I wanted to add. I thought about adding a poison effect, but I had no idea on how I'd make that different from the burn effect, so I scrapped it. And so then, after a while, I thought about having an element that would lower the enemy's defense. And so I came up with the acid element, which would have a chance to lower the enemy's defense for a period of time. And I was able to make 4 more spells from that. Starting on the next day, I worked on a new problem. There was only a limited amount of inventory slots that a player has, and with the way I have the game planned out so far, there just isn't enough space to store them all. So I decided to make it possible for the player to exchange weapons for money. And so now when the player right-clicks a slot, the weapon gets deleted, but the player now has more money and the space to get new weapons. Another element I've added is wind. And what it can do is that it has a chance to push enemies backwards. Though it's a really simple addition that made for even more spell types, there's not much else to talk about there. There was something else I need to get done that day no matter what, and it's something I've talked about adding ever since the first devlog. That being weapon attributes. And how it would work is that it would be similar to Terraria's modifiers. in which a modifier applies a permanent change to an item's statistics. And I think something like this would further promote the player into thinking carefully when choosing a weapon that they want to bring into the level. So I first made it so that the sword inventory grid would take and store the weapon's attributes along with everything else. And after some game dev magic and a lot of head smashing, this is what I have now. And so far, the only weapon attributes are Basic, Rusty, Shiny, Light, and Heavy. And these would modify the weapon's damage, attack speed, and projectile range. I'm really satisfied with the results. Of course, throughout all development this time, I've been adding more and more spells into the game, in which I now have a total of 30 more. But there's no way I can cover them all in this video, so have this instead. And so you might be saying to yourself right now, wow, that's a lot of things you've done in the span of a few days. Surely you'll take a break and touch grass, right? So far the weapons in your hand don't look anything like the weapons displayed in your inventory. And since that bothers me, I needed to redo all the sprites for the weapons in your hand. And so this is how weapons in your hand look like now. And that's all I have done for this week. I think I did a lot though. I made 6 new weapons, 30 plus more spells, gave sword elemental abilities and attributes, and even added 2 more elemental types, and a lot of sprite redrawings. I did everything I set up to do this week and I'm happy. Next devlog I'll hopefully work on releasing a new playable demo out for you all, but there's some things I need to get done first, such as a tutorial stage, main menu, getting sound effects and music into the game. That last part might be the most difficult since I'm not a music guy, and so this devlog might take a lot longer to get out than usual. I'll also be busy next week and I'm leaving back for school soon, so I guess we'll see what happens. Other than that, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and tell me what spells and weapons you'd like to see in my game. Anyways, have a great day. Bye.